Marcus Bell turned the dial with one finger, and the whole machine came alive in his hands like something that had been holding its breath for 50 years. A low hum filled the workshop. Then a sequence of clicks, sharp and deliberate, that no antique radio should have been able to produce. Marcus leaned closer to the speaker grill. The clicks resolved into a pattern, not static, not interference, a signal, numbers repeating in a rhythm too precise to be accidental. He had bought the transmitter for $40 at an estate sale, a dusty olive-drab box with a cracked dial and a frayed cord, and now it was speaking to him in a language he did not understand. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. "From which city in the world are you watching this video today? Drop your location in the comments below. If you love stories about people history tried to bury, hit subscribe right now. You won't regret it." Because when Marcus uploaded the recording of those clicks to the internet that night, two men in dark sedans were parked outside his shop by the time he opened the next morning. And what the old man in the wheelchair told them that same afternoon would make a decorated colonel lower his head and weep. What did that radio prove he had done? Morning came slow over the town of Caldwell, West Virginia. The fog rolled down out of the Allegheny Hills and settled in the hollows like spilled milk, and the sun did not so much rise as seep through it, gray turning to pale gold by degrees. Marcus Bell unlocked the front door of Bell Electronics Repair at 7:40, the way he did 6 days a week, and flipped the deadbolt and propped the door with the cinder block he kept for that purpose, because the hinge was old and the door swung shut on its own. He was 31 years old, narrow through the shoulders, with the kind of forearms a man develops from holding a soldering iron steady for 10 hours at a stretch. His hair was dark and perpetually a week past needing a cut. He wore a grey Henley with a burn hole near the cuff and a pair of jeans that had given up being blue. He moved through the shop, turning on the lights one bank at a time, the fluorescents stuttering before they caught. The shop smelled the way it always did, hot rosin and flux, the sweetish chemical tang of old capacitors, dust baked onto warm vacuum tubes, the faint ozone bite of equipment that had been running too long. Shelves lined every wall, sagging under the weight of radios and amplifiers and televisions in various states of surgery. A 1962 Zenith console sat half-gutted on the workbench. Behind the counter hung a corkboard, layered 3 deep with repair tickets, some of them years old, belonging to customers who had died or moved away or simply forgotten. Marcus poured coffee from the machine he had started before unlocking the door. Black, no sugar, in a mug that read "World's Okayest Fixer," a gift from his sister that had stopped being a joke and become simply the truth. He had owned the shop for 4 years. Before that, it had belonged to a man named Howard Pruitt, who taught Marcus the trade across a decade of afternoons that began when Marcus was a 14-year-old kid with a broken Walkman and nowhere else to be. Marcus's own father had left when he was 9, and his mother worked 2 jobs and was rarely home, and the boy had drifted through the town the way boys do when no one is watching them closely, half feral, looking for somewhere to belong. He found it in the warm, cluttered front room of a radio repair shop, where an old man with steady hands and few words let him sit and watch and eventually learn. Howard never lectured. He simply did the work and let the boy see it. And when Marcus asked a question, Howard answered it precisely and completely, and then said nothing more. It was the first patience anyone had ever shown him. He had not understood then that it was also the first love. Howard had no children and a bad heart, and when the heart finally gave out, he left the shop to Marcus in a will so short the lawyer read it in under a minute. Marcus had changed almost nothing. The same hand-painted sign hung in the window. The same brass bell rang above the door. The same workbench bore the same burn scars and solder splashes, a topography Marcus knew with his fingertips in the dark. He told himself he kept it that way out of respect, but the truth was simpler. He did not like change, and the shop was the one place on earth where every object had a logic he could trace with his hands. The world outside was full of things that could not be fixed. Mothers who got sick, fathers who did not come back, towns that emptied out as the mills closed one after another down the valley. Inside the shop, everything broken could be made to work again if you were patient enough and careful enough and willing to listen to what the machine was trying to tell you. Howard had taught him that too, though not in words. "You don't fix a radio by forcing it," the old man used to say, in one of his rare full sentences. "You fix it by finding out what it wants to do and helping it do that." Marcus had been 20 years old before he understood the old man might have been talking about more than radios. The estate sale had been the previous Saturday, out past the county line, a farmhouse emptied after the death of an old woman nobody in town seemed to have known well. Marcus went to estate sales the way other men went fishing. He liked the patience of it, the slow sifting through other people's lives, the occasional miracle buried under boxes of mason jars and water-stained paperbacks. He had found good things before. A working Hallicrafters receiver, a box of NOS tubes worth more than his truck. But the transmitter was different from the moment he saw it. It sat at the bottom of a steamer trunk in the farmhouse attic, wrapped in a wool blanket gone stiff with age beneath a layer of yellowed newspapers dated 1979. Olive drab steel, the corners rounded, the front panel crowded with dials and switches, and a frequency display behind cracked glass. There was no manufacturer's mark, no model number, just a small brass plate riveted to the side, and on the plate, stamped in characters worn nearly smooth, a serial designation. The woman running the sale wanted $10 for it. Marcus offered $40 for the transmitter and the trunk both, and she took it without blinking, glad to be rid of the weight. He had not thought much about it for 3 days. It sat in the corner of the shop under a drop cloth while he finished a backlog of paying work, 2 televisions and a guitar amplifier and a child's electronic keyboard, whose owner cried when Marcus told her it could be saved. But the transmitter pulled at him. He found himself glancing at the covered shape between jobs, the way you glance at a stranger across a room who seems to be watching you. Twice he lifted the corner of the cloth just to look at the worn brass plate again, at the characters stamped into it, at the absence of any maker's mark. On Tuesday night, alone in the shop with the rain coming down outside and drumming on the metal awning over the door, he finally pulled off the drop cloth entirely and rolled the machine onto the workbench under the good light. And that was when the strangeness began. Because the first thing he noticed, before he ever plugged it in, was that the inside did not match the outside. The case was civilian surplus, the kind of housing that held 1,000 different things in the decades after the war, the sort of box you could buy by the gross from Army-Navy stores and use for a generator controller or a field telephone or 1,000 other ordinary purposes. But the guts were not ordinary. Marcus had opened 10,000 radios in his life, and he had never seen a board laid out like this one. The soldering was immaculate, almost inhumanly neat, the joints bright and round and uniform as if done yesterday by a machine, except that no machine of that era could have done it, which meant a human hand had laid down every one of them with a steadiness Marcus had seen in only one other person in his life. He pushed that thought away before it fully formed. Components he could not identify sat in disciplined rows, hand-labeled with a paint pen in a code of letters and numbers that meant nothing to him. K7, V3, the designations of some private system. A second circuit board sat beneath the first, connected by a ribbon of wires the color of old bone, and this one had been potted in hard black epoxy so that its workings could not be seen or copied or understood, a featureless slab where the heart of the thing should be. Whoever built this had not wanted anyone to know how it worked. They had wanted it to function, and they had wanted it to keep its secret, even if it fell into the wrong hands. And those two desires together described not a hobbyist but a professional, someone for whom secrecy was not a preference but a discipline. And that, more than anything, was what made the hair stand up on Marcus Bell's arms. He should have stopped there. He would think about that later, in the weeks to come. Lying awake at 3 in the morning while the rain came and went, and the case sat dark on his workbench. He should have wrapped it back in the blanket and put it in the trunk and sold it to a collector and walked away clean. $40 turned into $400, a good week, nothing more. But he was a fixer. Fixers do not walk away from a mystery sitting on their own workbench. The not knowing itched at him, the way a fault in a circuit itched at him. A problem with a solution somewhere inside it, waiting. So he checked the power supply, traced the input stage, confirmed it could handle line voltage through a step-down transformer he kept for exactly these resurrections, wired in a fuse he trusted, and plugged it in. The dial glowed amber, a warm dead color from before he was born. The needle swung once and settled, and the machine began, very faintly, to hum. He let it warm up the way you warm up anything that old, slowly, watching the meters, ready to kill the power at the first sign of a short. Nothing shorted. The hum steadied into something almost musical. He reached for the main tuning dial, a heavy thing with a knurled edge, and turned it through the band. Static rose and fell. The ordinary chatter of the airwaves, a distant AM preacher, a burst of Spanish, the whine of some industrial machine bleeding across the spectrum. And then, at a frequency that should have held nothing at all, the clicks. Sharp, rhythmic, numbers. Marcus froze with his hand on the dial. He knew what number stations were. Every shortwave hobbyist did. Mysterious broadcasts, mostly from the Cold War, where a flat voice would read sequences of digits into the dark, presumed to be coded instructions for spies in the field. Most had gone silent decades ago. The few that remained were treated as ghosts, recorded and traded and argued over by enthusiasts who would never know what the numbers meant. But this was not a recording playing back from some distant station. This was coming from inside the machine on his bench. The transmitter was not receiving the signal, it was generating it. And it had been doing so, Marcus slowly understood, since the moment he gave it power, as if it had simply resumed a task that had been interrupted half a century ago and was waiting patiently to continue. His mouth had gone dry. He grabbed his phone, opened the voice recorder, and held it to the speaker. He let it run for 4 minutes, capturing the full cycle of the broadcast, the way the numbers grouped and repeated, and then gave way to a single sustained tone before beginning again. When it was done, he sat back on his stool and stared at the machine, and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely out of his depth. He had wanted a puzzle. He had not wanted this. That should have been the moment he understood he was holding something dangerous. But Marcus Bell was 31 and lived alone, and ran a shop where the most exciting event in a given week was a customer paying in exact change. So he did what people his age do when the world hands them something strange. He went home and he made a video, and he put it on the internet. The channel was small, a few hundred subscribers, mostly other repair hobbyists who liked watching him bring dead electronics back to life. He titled the video, "Mystery Military Transmitter, Still Broadcasting Numbers." What is this? He uploaded the 4-minute recording, talked over it for a few minutes, explaining what he had found, showed the unmarked boards and the epoxy-potted module and the worn brass serial plate. He asked his viewers if anyone could identify it. Then he ate a microwave dinner, fell asleep on the couch with the television on, and had no idea that across 3 time zones, in a building without a name, a piece of software that had been listening for exactly that signal for 49 years had just woken up. The first comment appeared at 11:52 that night. It came from an account with no profile picture, created the same day, with a username that was a random string of letters. The comment was a single line. "Where did you get this?" No question mark. Marcus did not see it until morning. By then there were others. He woke at 6:30 to a stiff neck, and the television hissing, and his phone buzzing on the floor, where it had slid out of his pocket. He picked it up and saw the notifications and frowned. The video had 4,000 views overnight, which made no sense for a channel his size. More than that, it had been shared, the little number climbing every time he refreshed, into forums he had never heard of, into corners of the internet that did not announce themselves. The comments were strange. Some were ordinary enough, hobbyists guessing at the model, arguing about the frequency. But threaded among them were others. "Take this down. You don't know what that is. Delete the video and the recording." One account, again created that day, had written only a string of numbers, and when Marcus looked closely, he realized they matched the sequence on his recording exactly, as if to prove the writer already knew. He sat up on the couch with his heart going faster than it should. He told himself it was nothing. The internet was full of people pretending to know secrets, full of role players and trolls and conspiracy theorists who would attach their fantasies to anything mysterious. He made coffee. He showered. He told himself again that it was nothing, and he almost believed it, right up until he pulled his truck into the gravel lot behind the shop at 7:35 and saw the two dark sedans parked across the street. They were the wrong cars for Caldwell. That was the first thing his mind snagged on. Caldwell was a town of pickup trucks and Rust Belt sedans held together with prayer, and these were new, black, clean, in a way that suggested they had been washed that morning with the kind of tinted windows you did not see outside of a city. They sat nose to tail at the curb across from his shop, engines off, and inside each one a figure Marcus could not quite make out. He sat in his own truck for a long moment with his hand on the key. Then he told himself, again, that it was nothing, and he got out and unlocked the shop and propped the door with the cinder block and turned on the lights one bank at a time, and the whole while he felt eyes on the back of his neck. The first customer of the day was Earl Tomlin, a retired mill worker who brought in the same console stereo every few months, with a different complaint, mostly because he was lonely, and the shop was warm, and Marcus let him talk. Earl was 78, and wore a feed store cap and had opinions about everything. He set his hands on the counter and looked out the front window at the sedans and said, "Those been there since before I parked. Government cars, those. You can tell by the plates." Marcus looked. The plates were ordinary state plates, but Earl shook his head. "Naw. Look at how clean. Look how they sit. I drove for the county 30 years. I know a fleet car when I see one." He sipped the coffee Marcus handed him out of habit. "You in some kind of trouble, son?" "No," Marcus said, and adjusted the tone arm on Earl's stereo, and did not look up. "No, I'm not in any kind of trouble." But his hands were not as steady as they should have been, and Earl noticed, and for once in his life, Earl Tomlin had the grace not to say anything about it. At 9:15, the bell above the door rang, and a young woman came in carrying a laptop with a cracked screen, and Marcus dealt with her, and it was ordinary and good, and for 10 minutes he forgot about the cars. At 10:30, a man came in looking for batteries Marcus did not carry. At 11 o'clock the phone rang, and it was a wrong number, except that when Marcus said hello there was a pause on the line, 3 full seconds of silence with the faint sound of breathing, and then a click as whoever it was hung up. Marcus set the phone down slowly. When he looked out the window again, one of the sedans was gone. The other remained. And then, at 11:40, the bell rang, and everything changed. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was who walked through the door. She was young, mid-20s at most, with dark hair pulled back severely, and the kind of posture that did not belong to anyone who had grown up slouching. She wore a charcoal coat too heavy for the weather and carried a leather folio under one arm. She crossed the shop with the unhurried confidence of someone who already knew exactly where everything was, and she stopped at the counter and looked at Marcus with eyes that were doing arithmetic. "Marcus Bell," she said. "That's me. Something I can fix for you?" "I hope so." She set the folio on the counter but did not open it. "My name is Dana Reyes. I'm a graduate student at the university, electrical engineering, with a focus in signals history. I saw your video last night." She paused. "So did a lot of people. I think you should know that not all of them are who they say they are." Marcus felt the back of his neck prickle again. "It's just an old radio." "It's not," Dana said quietly. "And I think you already know it's not, or you wouldn't have looked the way you did when I walked in." She glanced at the front window, at the remaining sedan, and something tightened around her mouth. "How long have those been out there?" "Since before I opened." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had hoped was not true. "Mr. Bell, that transmitter you found is generating a broadcast on a frequency that has been officially dead since 1977. I know because I've spent 2 years of my life studying the frequency. It's part of my dissertation. There were exactly 3 number stations that ever used that band. and all three are documented as having gone silent within a 6-month window in 1976 and 77. The records are very clear about it. Almost too clear. She lowered her voice. And the serial format on the plate in your video, the one you held up to the camera, isn't a manufacturer's mark. It's a U.S. military designation, a classified one. The shop had gone quiet. Earl Tomlin, who had been pretending to look at a shelf of vacuum tubes, was now openly listening. "How do you know that?" Marcus asked. "Because I cross-referenced it the second I saw it, and a database I have access to flagged it, and then, while I was looking at it, the entry disappeared, deleted in real time. Someone was watching that record." She finally opened the folio and slid out a single sheet of paper, a printout, a screenshot of a database entry. The fields were mostly redacted, black bars over the text, but two things were visible. The serial designation, matching the plate on Marcus's transmitter, and a single line of unredacted text beneath it. Program, Clearwater. Status, terminated 1977. Personnel, deceased. Marcus read it twice. "Deceased," he said. "Personnel deceased. So whoever built this is dead." "That's what the record says," Dana said. "But that signal didn't start broadcasting by itself. Someone built a machine 50 years ago that was designed to resume a transmission if it was ever powered up again. A dead man's switch in reverse. And the only person who would build something like that is someone who wanted to be found. Someday. By the right person." She looked at him steadily. "I don't think you found that transmitter by accident, Mr. Bell. I think it was waiting in that attic for somebody curious enough to plug it in." Outside, a second sedan rolled up and parked behind the first. 2 men got out. What happened next changed everything. They came across the street without hurrying, 2 men in dark jackets and the wrong shoes. And Marcus knew before they reached the door that Earl had been right, that these were not collectors or hobbyists or curious strangers. They moved the way the woman moved, with that trained economy, scanning the shop through the glass before they entered. The bell rang as the first one pushed the door open. He was somewhere in his 40s, with a flat, affable face and grey at the temples, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he has been trained to smile. "Morning," he said. "We're hoping you can help us out. You posted a video last night about a radio." He let the smile rest on his face. "We'd like to talk to you about it, and we'd like to take a look at the device, if it's on the premises." "Who's we?" Marcus said. "We represent an interested party," the man said. The second man had stopped just inside the door and stood with his hands loose at his sides, his eyes moving over the shop, over Earl, over Dana Reyes, lingering on Dana for a half-second longer than the rest. "There's a sensitivity around equipment of this type. It's really in everyone's interest that it be handled properly. We can make this very easy." "You got a badge?" Earl Tomlin said from the corner. "Fellas come in talking like that, they usually got a badge." The first man's smile did not change, but his eyes flicked to Earl and held there. "And you are?" "I'm a customer," Earl said. "I'm a paying customer in a place of business, and I'm wondering why 2 fellas with no names and no badges are asking a man to hand over his own property." The standoff held for a moment, the air thick. Then Dana Reyes spoke, and her voice had changed, gone clipped and formal in a way that made both men turn toward her. "If you're representing the agency that ran Clearwater," she said, "then you know that program was terminated and its records sealed, which means you have no active legal authority to seize anything related to it without a warrant. And if you're not representing that agency, then I'd very much like to know who you are, because I've already sent the serial designation and a copy of Mr. Bell's recording to 3 colleagues and my dissertation advisor, with instructions on what to do if I stop answering my phone." The first man looked at her for a long moment. Something recalibrated behind his eyes. "That was a mistake," he said quietly, spreading it around. "It was insurance," Dana said, and that's when things took a darker turn, because the second man, the one who had not spoken, finally moved. He walked to the counter, not toward Marcus, but toward the back of the shop, where the drop cloth covered a shape on the workbench, and Marcus realized with a lurch that he had not put the transmitter away, that it was sitting right there under thin canvas, that the man had known exactly where to go. "Hey," Marcus said. "Hey, that's not—" But the man had already pulled the cloth away, and there it was, the olive-drab box with its amber dial, and the man stood over it and went very still. "It's running," he said. His voice was low. "It's actually running." He looked back at his partner, and for the first time something cracked in the trained calm of both of them, something that looked almost like fear. "Get the colonel on the phone. Now!" The first man stepped outside, phone already at his ear. Through the glass, Marcus watched him talk, watched the way his free hand came up to his mouth, watched the rigid line of his shoulders. The second man stayed by the transmitter, not touching it now, just looking at it the way a man looks at a grave. The shop had gone utterly silent except for the faint, patient hum of the machine and the clicks rising and falling, the numbers continuing their 50-year report to no one. Earl Tomlin had stopped pretending to do anything at all. Dana Reyes had gone pale, but her jaw was set. The first man came back inside. The smile was gone now, replaced by something more honest and more grim. "Mr. Bell," he said, "I'm going to be straight with you, because the situation just changed, and I don't have time to manage it any other way. That device should not exist. Everyone who knew how to build it is recorded as dead. The program it belonged to was buried so deep that the people who buried it are mostly gone too. The fact that it's broadcasting means one of two things. Either someone reactivated it as a hoax, which my colleague has now confirmed is impossible given what he's looking at. Or—" he stopped. "Or the person who built it isn't dead," Dana said. "Or the person who built it isn't dead," the man repeated. He rubbed his face. "There's a man coming. He'll be here in a few hours. He has the authority to explain what he can and to clean up what he can't. Until he gets here, nobody touches that machine, nobody leaves, and nobody posts anything else online. Are we clear?" "You can't keep us here," Marcus said. "No," the man agreed. "I can't. But I'm asking you to stay, because in about 3 hours, a 78-year-old man is going to walk through that door. And when he sees what's sitting on your workbench, I think he's going to tell you a story that nobody alive has ever heard. And I think you're going to want to be in the room for it." He glanced at the transmitter. "I know I am." No one expected what came next. The hours passed strangely. The men outside multiplied to 4 and then settled. A coffee was made and went cold. Earl Tomlin, against all advice, refused to leave, planting himself on a stool by the counter with the stubbornness of a man who had decided this was the most interesting day of his retirement and would not be cheated of it. "I drove a school bus and a county dump truck for 40 years, he announced to no one in particular. "And nothing this interesting ever happened, and I'm not going home now." Dana Reyes sat with her folio closed in her lap and watched the transmitter with the hunger of a scholar who has spent years studying the shadow of a thing and is now looking at the thing itself. Marcus drifted through his own shop like a stranger, picking up tools and setting them down, unable to work, unable to sit, listening to the clicks that he now understood were not random at all, but a message sent over and over, waiting to be heard. One of the men by the door tried twice to get Marcus alone, to take him into the back room, just to clarify a few things. Both times Dana stood up before Marcus could answer, and both times the man reconsidered. There was a choreography to it that Marcus only half understood, a contest being conducted in glances and small movements, and he gathered that as long as the 4 of them stayed together, in the open, with Dana's insurance sitting in 3 colleagues' inboxes, the men could not do whatever it was they had originally come to do. The original plan had been simple, Marcus suspected. Confiscate the device, frighten the shopkeeper into silence, delete the video, make the whole thing vanish the way they had made a program, and its people vanish 50 years before. But the device was running, and that single fact had broken the plan, because a running machine meant a living maker, and a living maker was not a thing you could simply confiscate and shelve. So they waited, and Marcus waited, and the machine talked. It was Dana who broke the silence near the 2nd hour, speaking quietly so the men by the door would not hear. I want to tell you what I think it says, she said. The pattern. I've been counting it. She had a notebook out now, covered in tally marks and small precise diagrams. Numbers stations usually send 5-figure groups, long strings, monotonous, designed for a person with a one-time pad to copy down and decode later. This isn't that. This is structured differently. There's a header that repeats, then a body that changes slightly each cycle, then a tone. I think the header is an identifier, a call sign, and I think the body isn't a message to someone else. She looked up. I think it's a log. I think the machine is reporting its own status, saying I'm still here, I'm still running. The body changes a little each cycle because it's counting something, marking time. The way a lighthouse doesn't send words, it just says here, 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 to anything in the dark that might be looking. And whatever it's counting, it's a number that's been waiting half a century to be sent into a frequency nobody listens to anymore, because the one person who was supposed to hear it was told that the man who built it was dead. Marcus stared at the machine. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard, he said, and meant it. It's worse than sad, Dana said, because somebody, somewhere, kept a piece of software running for half a century that was tuned to catch exactly that signal if it ever came back on the air. Think about that. Through every budget cut, every reorganization, every change of administration, somebody in some windowless room kept a listening process alive on a dead frequency, an automated ear that nobody questioned because nobody remembered why it was there, just a line in a configuration file that said, "Monitor this band, flag any activity." They never stopped listening for him. They just never expected to hear him. She closed the notebook. Which means whoever's coming, that old man, he isn't coming because we found a radio. He's coming because the radio finally said his name, and a machine that had been listening for half a century finally heard it, and somewhere an alarm went off in a building that doesn't have a sign, and a very old secret stood up and started walking toward us. At 3:10 in the afternoon, a fifth vehicle pulled up outside, not a sedan, a modified van with a wheelchair lift. The men by the door straightened. One of them stepped outside, and the lift descended with a hydraulic whine. And Marcus watched through the glass as a wheelchair came down, and in the wheelchair sat an old man. He was thin in the way that very old men are thin, the flesh gone from his face so that the architecture of the skull showed through. But his eyes, even from across the street, were alert and pale and quick. He wore a cardigan the color of oatmeal and a flannel shirt buttoned to the throat. A blanket lay across his knees. The man who had spoken with Marcus walked beside the chair as one of the others pushed it across the street, and there was deference in the way they moved around him, a careful respect that Marcus had not seen them show to anyone, including each other. The bell rang as they brought him through the door. The old man's eyes went immediately past Marcus, past Dana, past Earl, to the workbench, to the transmitter, and he stopped breathing. Marcus saw it happen, saw the old chest go still beneath the cardigan, saw the pale eyes fill, saw one trembling hand rise from the blanket and reach toward the machine across the room, as if he could touch it from there. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clicks rose and fell. The numbers reported themselves into the warm air of the shop, and the old man in the wheelchair began, silently, to weep. "Mockingbird," he whispered. "Hello, Mockingbird. I thought you were gone." Then, after a moment, in a voice that cracked down the middle, "I thought I was gone." What did he mean? Drop a comment and tell us what you think before you watch the rest. And if stories about people the world erased speak to something in you, subscribe right now because this one is only getting started. His name, he told them, once they had wheeled him close to the bench and he had gathered himself, was Walter Keene. But that, he said, had not always been his name, and for a long stretch of his life it had not been any name at all. "When they're done with you," he said, "they don't just retire you, they erase you. There's a difference. You'll understand it before I'm finished." His voice was thin, but it had a residue of command in it, the cadence of a man who had once given orders and been obeyed. He asked for water, and Marcus brought it, And the old man drank with both shaking hands, and then he looked at the transmitter for a long time before he began. "I built that machine in 1974, he said, "in a room you won't find on any map, under a hillside about 40 miles from where we're sitting right now. They called the program Clearwater. The young lady's done her homework, I can see that. So she knows it's real, even if she doesn't know what it was." He glanced at Dana, with something like approval. What it was a lie factory, the cleanest one this country ever built. He told them then, and the story came out of him in the unhurried way of something that has been rehearsed in solitude for decades, told to the dark, told to no one. In the early 1970s, he said, the intelligence services had a problem. The Soviets had built a network of listening posts that swept the airwaves, monitoring American military and diplomatic traffic, and they had gotten good at it, good enough to read patterns in the noise and predict American movements. You could not stop them from listening. The air was the air, but you could control what they heard. And so Clearwater was born, a program designed not to hide signals, but to manufacture them, to flood the Soviet listening posts with traffic that was entirely false, troop movements that did not exist, supply convoys that never rolled, coded orders to units that had been disbanded years before. The goal was to make the truth indistinguishable from the noise, to bury the real American signals under an avalanche of convincing lies. "You have to understand how hard that is," Walter said, and for a moment the engineer in him surfaced through the old man, animated, almost young. "Any fool can broadcast a fake message. The Russians weren't fools. They had analysts who'd spent their whole careers listening to American radio operators. They knew our equipment by its signature, the little imperfections every transmitter has, the way you'd know a man by his handwriting. They knew our operators by their fist, the rhythm of how a particular man sent Morse, as personal as a voice. So a fake signal couldn't just say the right words. It had to come from a transmitter that sounded like a real one, with all the right flaws. And it had to be sent in a fist that matched a real operator who really existed in their files. We built machines that could imitate a specific radio. We built machines that could imitate a specific man's hand on the key. I spent 8 months once perfecting the fist of a sergeant in Germany who'd been dead for 2 years, so that the Russians would keep believing he was alive and at his post, because his being alive made a whole fictional battalion believable." He shook his head slowly. "We resurrected dead men on the radio so the enemy would chase ghosts. I didn't know then how good I was getting at a particular kind of work, bringing the dead back to life on the air, making absence sound like presence. It turned out to be the skill that would define everything that happened to me." He described the room then, because Dana asked, leaning forward, and the description came out of him with the precision of a place he had walked in his mind every night for 50 years. "It was 40 feet down," he said, "reached by a freight elevator disguised as a maintenance shed on the surface, a long, low concrete vault that had been dug into the hillside for some earlier purpose, nobody told him, and repurposed for Clearwater. The air was always the same temperature, 68 degrees, dehumidified to protect the equipment, so that he lost all sense of season, all sense of weather, all sense of time, except what the clocks told him. There were no windows, because there was nothing to see. The walls were lined with equipment racks, reel-to-reel recorders, oscilloscopes, transmitters the size of refrigerators, and the whole place hummed, a deep electrical drone that got into your bones and stayed there, that he could still hear sometimes in the silence of his small clean rooms in the decades after. There were 6 of them down there, then 4, then, near the end, only 2. They worked in shifts that did not correspond to day or night. They ate food brought down in carts. They slept in bunks against the far wall, and they spoke, into the airwaves, to an enemy that was listening, in the voices of men who did not exist, and the enemy believed them, and somewhere because of their lies, real American soldiers moved safely through gaps that the Soviets were looking the wrong way to see. "We never fired a weapon," Walter said. "We never saw a battlefield. But I have always believed, and I will die believing, that we saved lives, real lives. Boys who came home because the men hunting them were chasing the ghosts we made." He paused. I needed to believe that. It was the only thing that made the rest of it bearable. They needed people who understood signals, Walter said, not soldiers, engineers. Men who could build a transmitter that sounded exactly like the real thing, who could fake the fist of a radio operator on the other side of the world, who could generate traffic so authentic that the analysts in Moscow would stake their careers on it being genuine. I was 26 years old. I'd built my first radio at 9, out of parts I scavenged from a dump, and I'd nearly burned the house down doing it, and my father beat me for it, and my mother cried, and the next week I built another one because I couldn't help myself. They found me at a research lab in Ohio, and they made me an offer, and within a month I was underground in West Virginia, building machines that would tell the Russians stories. He smiled faintly. I was very good at it. That was the tragedy of my life, son. I was so good at telling lies in code that they decided the best lie of all was me. Marcus said, "What do you mean?" The old man did not answer right away. "I'll get there," he said. "Let me tell you the cost first, because the cost is the part nobody ever hears. The loneliness. You can't tell anyone, not ever. I had a girl before in Ohio, and I couldn't tell her where I was going or why, and after a year of letters that said nothing, she stopped writing, and I couldn't blame her. My mother thought I worked for the Defense Department in an office somewhere. My sister thought I'd become dull and secretive and a little cold, and she was right, I had. Because how do you stay warm when there's a wall down the middle of you and everyone you love is on the other side of it? They build that wall into you a brick at a time, and by the time you notice, you can't take it down. Even now, 50 years later, sitting here telling you the truth at last, I can feel it. I'm telling you the most honest things I've ever said to another living soul, and there's still a part of me standing back behind that wall watching me do it, and waiting to see what it costs." He looked at his hands. "That's what they make you. Not a spy, not a hero, just a man who can't quite reach the people in front of him anymore. And then, when they were done with me, they made it official. They put it on paper. They turned the wall into a tombstone." The old man's smile faded. "In 1976, the program was compromised, not badly. A clerk, a leak. The details don't matter anymore, and most of them I was never told. But there was a risk that the Soviets would realize Clearwater existed, and if they realized it existed, then everything we'd ever sent them became suspect. Every lie re-examined. And worse, they'd start hunting for the people who'd built it. So the decision came down from somewhere above me, somewhere I never saw, that the program would be terminated and the personnel would be protected. And the way they chose to protect us." He paused. He looked at his own hands. "The way they chose to protect us was to make us dead." The shop was silent. Even the men by the door were listening now. "They gave me a choice, the way they always tell you they gave you a choice, which means no choice at all. I could surface as myself and live the rest of my life as a target, a man the Soviets had every reason to want silenced, with my family beside me as targets too. Or I could die. On paper. They had a cover ready. They told my family, my mother, my sister, that I'd been killed in Vietnam." He laughed, a dry rasp with no humor in it. "Vietnam. I never set foot in Vietnam. I never left this state. But they needed a death that no one would question. And a young man killed overseas in those years, that was a death that closed itself, that no one was going to dig into. So Walter Keane, the real one, the one my mother named, died in a war he never fought in, and they buried an empty box, and my mother cried over a flag they folded and handed her, and I watched it happen from 40 miles away through a one-way arrangement they set up so I could see her one last time without her ever knowing I was there." He stopped. His jaw worked. Dana had her hand pressed to her mouth. Earl Tomlin had taken off his cap and was holding it against his chest without seeming to know he had done it. "They let me watch the funeral," Walter said. "That was the kindness they offered, and I took it. God help me, I took it. There was a man in the program whose whole job was managing the families of the dead and the not dead, and he understood that a man could not simply vanish from his own life without one last look, and so he arranged it. A car with tinted windows, parked across the road from the cemetery. far enough back that no one would notice. I sat in that car in a borrowed suit, as if I were going to my own funeral, which I suppose I was, and I watched them lower an empty casket into the ground with my name on the stone. I watched my mother's knees give out. I watched my sister catch her. I watched a chaplain I'd never met say words over a box of sandbags in a folded uniform, and I watched a rifle salute fired into a grey sky for a soldier who'd never held a rifle. And I sat in that car, and I did not make a sound, because making a sound would have undone everything and put the two of them in danger. And so I learned, that afternoon, the final lesson of my trade. I learned how to grieve in total silence. I learned how to mourn myself. His voice had gone very low. My mother died 4 years later, still believing her son was a hero who'd fallen overseas. My sister carried that grief to her own grave in 2009. I read the obituary in a library, sitting at a microfilm reader, an old man looking at the death notice of his baby sister, unable to attend the funeral, unable to send flowers, unable to do anything but read the words and fold them up and put them away. I had outlived everyone who'd loved the real me, and not one of them ever knew I was alive. The shop was silent. Even the men by the door were listening now, and one of them, the younger one, had turned his face away. They gave me a new name and a new life and a small pension and a promise that I would never be bothered, Walter went on. And mostly they kept it. I moved away, out west for a while, then to the coast, then back, drifting, the way you drift when no place has any claim on you. I came back to this part of the world years later, when everyone who might have recognized me was old or dead. I lived quiet. I never married, because how do you tell a woman who you are when you don't know yourself anymore? And how do you build a life on a foundation that's a lie all the way down? I worked small jobs. I fixed radios, as a matter of fact. He looked at Marcus, and something passed between them, some recognition across 50 years and one trade. I fixed radios for 20 years in a shop not so different from this one, 2 counties over, and not one customer ever knew that the old man soldering their amplifier had once whispered lies into the ear of the Soviet Union. They'd bring me their broken things, and I'd mend them and hand them back, and there was a peace in that I can't explain. After a life spent making things that deceived, I spent my old age making broken things work again. It was the only honest work I ever did, and I think it saved whatever was left of me. But the transmitter, Marcus said. Why build the transmitter? Why make it broadcast? Because they took everything, Walter said simply. My name, my family, my death, even my death belonged to them. And a man can't live with nothing. A man has to keep one thing that's his. He looked at the machine. Before they shut the program down, before they processed me out, I had a few weeks alone in that room with all that equipment, decommissioning it, wiping the records, dismantling 4 years of work with my own hands. And in those weeks, in the hours when no one was watching, I built myself a witness. I took a surplus case, the most ordinary thing I could find, and I built a transmitter inside it that did only one thing. It sent a single message, my real call sign, my real designation, Mockingbird, the one they were about to erase, on the frequency I'd worked for 4 years. I built it to run on almost nothing, to sip power, to last. I built it so that if it ever lost power and got power again, it would start over and keep sending, patient, tireless, a machine with one purpose and all the time in the world. And I sealed up the part that mattered, potted it in epoxy so no one could see how it worked, or copy it, or more to the point, shut it up. A man can be silenced. I'd spent 4 years proving that. But I wanted to build one voice that couldn't be. His voice dropped. And then I hid it. I hid it with the only person left in the world who knew I was alive. A woman. The one person they'd trusted to handle me on the outside. My handler, my contact, the human being assigned to manage the ghost of Walter Keane. Eleanor. He said the name the way you set down something you've carried a long way. Eleanor Vance. She was 28 when they gave me to her, a young intelligence officer with a steel spine and the saddest eyes I ever saw. And she did her job. She watched me and reported on me and made sure I stayed bought and stayed quiet. And somewhere in all those years of watching a dead man try to be alive, she stopped doing her job and started doing something else. She started loving me. And I loved her. And we could never do a single thing about it, because she knew exactly what I was and exactly what they'd do if we ever became a risk. And so we loved each other across the same wall they'd built into me, for 49 years, mostly in silence, mostly from a distance, two people who'd given their lives to secrecy, keeping the biggest secret of all, which was each other. He had to stop again. Marcus brought him more water. The old man's hand shook so badly he could barely hold the cup. "She kept the transmitter for me," Walter said when he could speak again. "She kept it for 49 years, and she never plugged it in, because she understood that the day it spoke would be the day I either came back or was truly gone, and she loved me too much to find out which. As long as it stayed silent in her attic, we were both still in the in-between, both still alive in the small, impossible way we'd managed to be alive. Plugging it in meant ending that. It meant choosing. And she could never choose, and neither could I. And so it sat in the dark above her head for half a century, while we grew old in our separate quiet houses, writing letters we burned, meeting once or twice a year in diners off the interstate as if we were strangers, holding hands under the table like teenagers, two ghosts in love. He closed his eyes. She died this spring, her heart in her sleep, the way mine should have gone. And she had no family either. The work doesn't leave you any. And so the house and everything in it went to the county to be sold, and the attic was emptied by strangers who had no idea what they were carrying down those stairs. The farmhouse, the estate sale. He opened his eyes and looked at Marcus, and they were full. "That was Eleanor's house, son. You bought my witness out of the attic of the only woman who ever truly knew me, 8 days after they put her in the ground. She kept my voice safe her whole life, and when she was gone it found its way, by $40 in an accident, to a young man curious enough to turn the dial. I think she'd have liked that. I think she'd have laughed. She had a wonderful laugh. I heard it maybe 100 times in 50 years, and I remember every single one." The clicks rose and fell. The numbers reported themselves. And Marcus understood at last what he had heard the first time he turned the dial, what the machine had been saying patiently into the dark for half a century. It had been saying, "I am still here. I am still here. I am still here." And now, finally, someone had answered. But that wasn't the full story, because the man Walter had been waiting for, the one the agents had called the Colonel, had not arrived yet, and when he did, the story would turn one more time. The bell rang at 4:40. The man who came through it was old too, though a decade younger than Walter, broad and upright, with a white mustache and a bearing that had survived whatever life had thrown at it. He wore a civilian suit, but he wore it like a uniform. He stopped just inside the door, and his eyes found the man in the wheelchair, and Marcus watched the recognition move across his face in stages, disbelief, and then certainty, and then something close to grief. "My God," the man said. "Mockingbird. They told us Mockingbird was dead." Walter looked up at him. "Hello, Colonel. You've gotten old." "So have you," the Colonel said, and his voice was unsteady. He crossed the shop slowly and stood before the wheelchair and looked down at the old engineer, and then, in front of everyone, the Colonel came to attention and raised his hand in a salute that trembled at the top of its arc and held. "I read your file," he said. "I read it 100 times. Killed in action, 1976. I put your name on the wall myself. There's a star for you at Langley, in the lobby, in the marble. I've stood under it. I never knew which star was yours because they wouldn't tell us the names. But I stood under that wall and I thanked all of you, every nameless one. And one of those stars was for a man who was alive this whole time, fixing radios 2 counties over." His hand came down slowly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We thought we were honoring you. We were mourning a man who was sitting in the dark waiting for somebody to listen." "You were honoring the lie," Walter said, not unkindly. "It was a good lie. I built it myself, remember." He nodded toward the transmitter. "But I built one true thing. And it took 49 years, and it found its way to a young man with a soldering iron and too much curiosity, and here we all are." He looked around the shop, at Marcus, at Dana, at Earl with his cap still over his heart. "Witnesses," he said. "That's all I ever wanted, not a medal, not an apology, though I'll take the apology, Colonel, since you're offering. I wanted somebody to know that I existed, that the name on that wall belonged to a real man who did real work and was not, in fact, a corpse in a box in Vietnam. I wanted the record corrected before I die, which the doctors tell me is not far off now." He smiled. "And the only way I could think to make the record speak was to make a machine that wouldn't stop talking." The colonel pulled a stool over with an unsteady hand and lowered himself onto it so that he was level with the man in the wheelchair. And for a moment the two old men simply looked at each other, and the years seemed to thin between them. "I came into the program in '74, the colonel said quietly. "Just a lieutenant then, a kid, running liaison between your shop and the people upstairs. I never came down to the room, they wouldn't let me. But I read the take. I read what Clearwater was sending, and I read the Soviet intercepts when we got them, and I watched the enemy believe our ghosts, over and over. And I knew, even as a kid, that I was watching something close to genius. I didn't know your face. I knew your work. Mockingbird was a legend in the part of the building I worked in. The operator whose fabrications were so clean that twice we had our own analysts flag your fake traffic as genuine and panic over troop movements that didn't exist. We had to brief our own side to ignore you. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You were so good that you fooled the people you were working for." He shook his head. "And then one day the take stopped, and they told us the program was wound down and the personnel lost, and I believed it because why wouldn't I? And I went on with my career, and I rose, and I retired, and I grew this ridiculous mustache, and the whole time you were 2 counties over, fixing toasters." "Radios," Walter said. "Mostly radios." "Radios," the colonel agreed and laughed, and the laugh broke in the middle into something else, and he pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. The colonel turned to the agents by the door. "Whatever your instructions were," he said, "they're rescinded. Nobody touches that device. Nobody touches these people. This man is going to be recognized properly, in the light, while he can still see it happen, and if anyone in the chain has a problem with that, they can come find me, and I will personally make their life a misery for whatever time I have left. And I have a great deal of practice at being a difficult old man." He looked back at Walter. "It'll take time. There are processes, declassification, review boards, lawyers, people who'd rather this stayed buried because buried is easier, and nobody ever got promoted for reopening a 50-year-old grave. But it's coming. I'll spend whatever I have left making it come." "I don't have whatever you have left," Walter said gently. "I have months. Maybe less. The doctors are very precise about it, which I appreciate. After a lifetime of vagueness, it's a relief to be told a clear number." "Then we'll move fast," the colonel said. What happened over the next weeks moved faster than anyone in that shop would have believed possible. But it did not move without cost, and it did not move without one more secret rising to the surface. And that secret, when it came, would change how Marcus Bell understood his own life. The colonel was as good as his word. Within 10 days a small team had come to the shop, careful and quiet, and documented the transmitter where it sat, because Walter refused to let it be moved until it had been recorded exactly as found, still running, still speaking. Dana Reyes, to her astonishment, was brought into the process as a technical consultant, her 2 years of dissertation work suddenly classified and invaluable, the only complete independent analysis of the Clearwater frequency that existed outside the agency's own sealed files. She decoded the message on the record, formally, and it was exactly what she had guessed. A call sign, a designation, Mockingbird active. The single message a machine had been built to send the instant it was ever given power again, after 49 years of waiting in the dark for that current to come. Marcus expected to be pushed out, to be thanked and silenced and forgotten, the accidental civilian who had stumbled into something too large for him. Instead, the old man asked for him, specifically, again and again. Walter Keene had no family. The family he might have had was a flag folded in a box, and a mother 50 years in her grave, and a sister who had died believing her brother fell in a war. And so, in the strange way that the end of a life sometimes reaches out and grabs a stranger, Walter began to treat the young man who had found his witness as something more than a stranger. He asked Marcus to drive him places. He asked Marcus to sit with him in the long afternoons. He told Marcus things he had never told the agents, small things, the texture of a life lived underground, the names of men long dead, the way the room under the hillside had smelled of concrete and ozone and loneliness. It was on one of those afternoons, with the autumn light coming gold through the shop windows, and the transmitter finally silent, its broadcast recorded, and its purpose fulfilled, that the last secret came out. Walter had asked to hold the brass serial plate, which had been removed from the case for documentation, and returned to him at his insistence. He turned it over in his thin fingers and ran his thumb across the worn characters, and was quiet for a long while. Then he said, without looking up, "Pruitt, the man who owned this shop before you, Howard Pruitt." Marcus went very still. "How do you know that name?" "Because I knew him," Walter said. "Not well, but I knew him." He set the plate down on the bench. "There were others in Clearwater, son. Engineers like me. Most of them took the same deal I did. The death certificate, the new name, the silence. But a couple of them, the ones with families they couldn't bear to leave, took a different arrangement. They didn't die on paper. They just disappeared into ordinary lives, watched from a distance, told never to speak of it, given a trade to hide behind." He looked at Marcus. "Howard Pruitt fixed radios in Caldwell, West Virginia, for 40 years. Did you never wonder why a small-town repairman knew things about signal theory that they don't teach in any school? Did you never wonder where an old man learned to lay out a circuit board the way I laid out mine?" Marcus's mouth had gone dry. He thought of the immaculate solder joints inside the transmitter, identical, he realized now, to the joints inside every radio Howard had ever repaired, a signature, a fist, as personal as handwriting. He thought of Howard at the workbench, the patience of him, the way he could diagnose a fault by ear, by the smell of a failing component, by some sense that seemed almost supernatural to a 14-year-old boy. He thought of the things Howard had taught him that he had never thought to question, techniques that were a generation more sophisticated than anything else in a town like Caldwell. Methods Marcus had assumed every repairman knew until he met other repairmen and discovered they did not. He thought of how Howard never spoke of his life before the shop, how he'd deflect any question about his past with a shrug and a return to the work, how there were no photographs of a younger Howard anywhere, no family, no stories, as if the man had simply appeared in Caldwell one day, fully formed with a soldering iron in his hand. "He never said a word," Marcus said. "He couldn't," Walter said. "That was the deal, same as mine, but with one mercy added. The men with families they couldn't bear to leave weren't made dead. They were made to vanish quietly instead, relocated, renamed, given a trade to hide behind, and a town that asked no questions. Howard took that arrangement because he had a wife then. She passed long before you came along, I'd imagine, or he'd never have let a stray boy get so close. But he took the deal to keep her safe, and the price was the same price we all paid. The wall, the silence, the life lived behind glass. The only difference between Howard and me was that they let him keep his heartbeat in the records. They still took everything else." Marcus could only shake his head. He had wondered, in the way a child wonders, briefly and then not at all, accepting the strange competence of the adults around him as simply the way the world was. "When I built that witness," Walter said, "when I hid it with Eleanor, I told her that if it ever spoke, if anyone ever came asking, there was one person in this part of the world who would understand what it meant, one person who'd been where I'd been, who carried the same wall, who could explain it to whoever found it without breaking under the weight. I gave her Howard Pruitt's name. I said, if it comes to it, Eleanor, take it to the radio man in Caldwell. He'll know what it is. He'll know what to do." He shook his head slowly, marveling. Eleanor never did. She was too afraid of what it would mean, too afraid of losing the in-between we lived in. And Howard died before any of it came to pass, his bad heart, the same year mine started going. His shop passed to a boy he'd taken in off the street, a boy with no father, and a mother who worked too hard and nowhere to belong. A boy he taught the way I'd have taught a son if they'd ever let me have one. And that boy went to an estate sale half a century later and bought an olive drab box for $40 because he couldn't walk away from a mystery. Walter's pale eyes spilled over at last. Do you see it, son? I built that machine to find a man like Howard, and it found Howard's boy instead. It found the thing Howard made after Howard was gone. You think you inherited a shop. You inherited a thread. It runs from me through a room under a hillside to a careful, silent man who loved you more than he could ever say, and then to you. You're the end of it. You may be the only one left alive who knows the whole shape of it. And I truly think, that somewhere Howard is glad it was you who turned the dial. Marcus could not speak. The shop blurred and swam. He looked at the workbench where Howard had stood for 40 years, at the corkboard of old repair tickets in Howard's small, precise hand, at the brass bell over the door, and the whole inheritance rearranged itself in his mind into something larger and stranger and infinitely more tender than he had ever known. The shop had not just been a shop. The trade had not just been a trade. It had been a hiding place and a refuge, and a long, quiet act of a man passing on the only true thing he was permitted to give to the only person he was permitted to give it to. Every hour Howard had spent teaching him, every patient correction, every wordless afternoon, took on a new and aching dimension. The old man had been giving Marcus the one inheritance the government had not been able to take from him, not the secret, the skill, the hands, the way of listening to a broken thing until it told you what it needed. He'd have wanted you to know, Walter said, gentler now. He couldn't tell you while he lived. The deal held even past death, for the families, for the safety of it. But he'd have wanted you to know in the end what your hands learned and where it came from, and whose hands taught his. You're holding a thread that runs back through that old man to me, and to a room under a hillside, and to a war of lies that nobody won, and nobody lost, and nobody was ever allowed to remember. You're the end of that thread, maybe the only one left who'll carry it. So carry it. That's all I ask. Not loudly. Howard wasn't loud, and neither am I. Just carry it, and someday, when you're old, find your own stray boy with nowhere to belong, and teach him to fix what's broken, and let the thread run on. The recognition came in the spring. It was small, as these things are, conducted in a room with no windows and too few chairs, attended by men in dark suits and 3 old soldiers and 1 colonel with a white moustache who could not stop clearing his throat. Walter Keene, formally restored to himself, his death certificate voided by an order that Marcus was not permitted to read, was awarded a decoration that did not officially exist for a program that officially never happened. The citation was classified. The medal was placed in his hands rather than pinned to his chest, because pinning it would have required him to stand, and he could no longer stand. Dana Reyes was there, her dissertation now permanently sealed, but her career paradoxically made by it, recruited before she had even finished by people who valued exactly the kind of mind that could hear a pattern in noise. Earl Tomlin was not permitted to attend, which he complained about bitterly for the rest of his life, telling anyone who would listen at the feed store that he had been there at the start, that he had been the one who said those were government cars, and being entirely disbelieved. And Marcus Bell was there because Walter had insisted, because Walter had no one else, because in the strange arithmetic of the old man's erased and recovered life, the young fixer had become the nearest thing to kin. Marcus stood at the back and watched a frail man in a wheelchair receive, at 78, an acknowledgement that he had existed. It was not enough. Everyone in the room knew it was not enough. 50 years of being dead cannot be repaid with a classified medal and a folded order. But it was something. It was the record, corrected. It was the truth, spoken aloud in a room, witnessed. And when the colonel knelt down beside the wheelchair so that he could speak quietly to the old man, Marcus saw Walter Keene smile, fully, for the first and last time, the smile of a man who has finally been heard. Walter died 8 days later, in his sleep, in a small clean room with the autumn into spring light coming through the window. He had asked that the transmitter be given to Marcus, and the request, astonishingly, was honored. The device declassified down to its potted heart and released into the hands of the only person Walter had named in a will as short as Howard Pruitt's had been. Marcus brought it back to the shop. He did not run it. The message had been sent and received and recorded and understood, and there was no need to make it speak again. Instead, he built a case for it, glass on the front, oak around the sides, and he mounted it on the wall of the shop, where the light from the front window would catch the amber dial in the mornings. Beneath it he fixed a small brass plate, made by his own hands, and on it he had stamped a single line, for the ones who were erased and the ones who kept listening. He hung Howard's photograph beside it, the only one he had, an old shot of the man at this same workbench, soldering iron in hand, not looking at the camera, lost in the work. Marcus had walked past that photograph 10,000 times and never once understood the whole of who he was looking at. He understood now. And in understanding, he found that the shop had changed around him without changing at all, that every tool on the bench and every technique in his hands had become a kind of inheritance more profound than the building or the trade, a thread passed hand to hand by men who were not permitted to explain what they were giving. Dana Reyes came back through Caldwell that summer, on her way to a posting she was not allowed to describe. She stood in front of the case on the wall for a long time. "I spent 2 years," she said, "studying a frequency that everyone told me was dead. 3 number stations, all silent by 1977, case closed, nothing more to learn, and the whole time one of them wasn't dead at all. It was just waiting." She turned to Marcus. "Makes you wonder what else is out there still broadcasting. How many machines, how many people, how many true things, sending their one message into a band where nobody's listening anymore." "Somebody listened to this one," Marcus said. "You did," she said, "by accident, for $40. She smiled. He couldn't have planned it better if he'd tried. Maybe he did try. Maybe that's exactly what he planned. A machine that would wait as long as it had to for the one curious person who couldn't leave a mystery alone. She picked up her bag. "Thank you, Marcus, for not taking the video down, for not handing it over when they asked. A lot of people would have." After she left, Marcus stood alone in the shop in the long evening light, the way Howard must have stood 10,000 times, the way Walter had stood in his own shop 2 counties over for 20 silent years. He thought about all the things a man could be without anyone knowing. He thought about the lies that win wars and the truths that get buried under them. He thought about a young engineer in a room under a hillside, building one honest machine in a factory of falsehoods, sealing up its heart so that no one could silence it, hiding it with a woman who loved him and instructing her to carry it, if it ever spoke, to the radio man in Caldwell. He thought about how close that thread had come to breaking, over and over across 50 years, and how it had held barely by accident by $40 and an estate sale and a fixer who could not walk away. The brass bell hung over the door, silent. The corkboard sagged with its old tickets. The transmitter sat in its glass case, dark now, its work complete. And Marcus Bell, who had inherited more than he ever knew, locked up the shop as the sun went down behind the Allegheny Hills and drove home through the gathering dark, carrying a thread that ran back further than he could see, into rooms that did not appear on any map, toward men whose names were stars in a wall with no names at all. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that some truths deserve to be spoken, no matter how long they've been buried, no matter how deep, no matter how many years a man has to wait in the dark for someone to finally turn the dial and listen, then subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. More people the world tried to erase. More machines still quietly sending their one true message into the silence, waiting, the way the best of us wait, for someone curious enough and stubborn enough and kind enough to hear it. Have you ever discovered that someone close to you was carrying a secret far larger than you imagined? Tell us in the comments. And remember, sometimes the quietest people in the smallest towns are the ones who once whispered to the whole world in code.